Sometimes history is tucked away in a secluded park. Sometimes it's hiding off of a mountain trail. And sometimes it's hiding right in plain sight.
It's a Saturday afternoon. I'm in Oksu-dong. I've brought you here because of a street name, particularly the name of this street. You know, as a native English speaker, when I hear the names of places and streets or whatever, if there is a meaning associated with the words that make up the name, I can't escape that association, right? I mean, if there's a town called Pine Ridge, I just think of a mountain ridge of pine trees. You can't escape it. Maple Street, Maple Tree, Church Street. I see steeples, you know? With Korean street names and place names, it doesn't really work that way for me. Even when I know the syllables that comprise the word, or if I know the word itself, I still often don't associate a meaning. It's just a name. I have to intentionally make the connection. Now, there are a few names where it's automatic for me these days just because of repetition. I've thought about the connection so often, or I've explained it to people. For example, Gangnam, south of the river, Namdaemun, the Great South Gate, Dongdaemun, the Great East Gate. Those are pretty automatic for me now. But most names do not have that kind of association for me. So I just go through life looking at place names and street names and not making any connections with what they might mean. And now and again I do. Something will catch my eye and spark my curiosity. I'll see a name and something about it will just make me think, I think I know what this means. Is that really what it means? And if so, why? Now, sometimes I think I know the meaning of a name, but then I come to find out that I really don't. Korean syllables are often associated with Chinese characters, and the same syllable can have different meanings depending on the Chinese character it's representing in that context. But in this case, the name of this street is Oksu-dong-ro. Oksu-dong-ro. This is an interesting name. I've walked down the street countless times. Just at the other end of it is Hannam-dong. And down at this end of it, there's an old market. And in between, I've had reason to come along the street many, many times in the days when I lived in Hannam-dong, and I never really paid any attention to the name or what it might mean until recently. And I guess that's kind of a consequence of making these YouTube videos. I'm starting to become more conscious of the names. You see, I was going to make a video about Hannam-dong and about some of my memories of Hannam-dong and talk about how it's changed. And I just happened to notice the name of the street for, who knows, the 1000th time. But this time, something about it registered with me. I think it's that dang in the name, because lately I've been seeing that a lot because I've been looking into old Joseon era buildings. I recently did a video about one, a hidden historical gem downtown, an administrative hall that was used for military administration. Dang can be translated as hall. So that caught my eye this time, and dokso means usually reading, So they wouldn't have named this Reading Hall Street for giggles, right? There must be something associated with it. And lo and behold, of course there is. And it's commemorated by this stone. Oksu-dong to. To means sight. Now right next to it, you'll see this English here. It gives a truncated, very truncated history. It doesn't even tell you when it was built. If you just go by this, you'd believe it was built in 1426, but that's not the case. So what happened in 1426 is King Sejong, the fourth Joseon king, he's the one who created the Korean alphabet, Hangul. King Sejong started this program called Saga Dokso.
This is where the connection between Chinese characters and Hangul got me into trouble. My first understanding of Saga Dokso was that saga referred to a private home, and that this could be translated as reading in a private home or just reading at home. So I understood it to mean that Sejong was sending his scholars home for independent study. But saga can also mean furlough, being sent away from duty. So once I learned that, it seemed like that is the more appropriate translation. And I have since discovered that the Chinese characters for saga in Saga Dokso indeed refer to the meaning of furlough. So Saga Dokso is a reading furlough, a reading sabbatical.
And what it was a way to cultivate young scholars. So people in their 20s and 30s, he would send them on a sabbatical from their government duties to spend time immersing themselves in Confucian and historical readings. It was a time of, self-study for them to level up their knowledge, I guess, and make them better scholars. And some of them would go on to become, top big-name scholars. So this program eventually came to an end, but there were different iterations of it in the following decades. And then in the early 16th century, around 1516, King Jungjong decided to start a new edition of the Saga Dokso. Initially, he had them studying somewhere over near Dongdaemun, what is now Sungin-dong. But people told him, hey, look, this isn't a suitable place for study. You need something that's quieter, something away from all the hustle and bustle of the city, and free of distraction. And so they built this place here. But why here? Why this spot? We're about 2.5 kilometers or so from Gwangmi-mun, which is the southeast gate of the city wall. And you've got Maebong-san just on the other side of these apartments. Between us and what is the old city. So this was very much an out-of-the-way location, but it wasn't chosen randomly. This gets back to my failure to associate meanings with names. Look at this blue sign right here. On the right side of it, you see Dongho-do, and above that there's a green box. There's no English there, but what it says is Dongho-daegyo, so Dongho Bridge. What does Dongho mean? East Lake. East Lake. So further on up here, Oksu-dong Street, Reading Hall Street, runs into what is today called East Lake Street. And East Lake Street goes over by Oksu Station, which is situated right at the north end of Dongho Bridge. East Lake Bridge. I'm embarrassed that I never made this connection before. I know what Dongho is. I know that many, many times when I've been in this area, when you go down on that side over there toward Oksu Station, there's a rather steep slope that goes down into what has always felt like a bowl to me. This used to be the East Lake. So you can see this street goes downhill here. It's probably more visible if we come over here and look at it. Yeah, it's probably hard to tell, but every time I've been down in this area, it's just always felt like a bowl. So this used to be Dongho, the East Lake, and it was kind of almost like a resort area during the Joseon Dynasty. So you had a lot of like nobility and scholars who would build villas around here. You got Maebongsan right here. You've got Umbongsan off over in this direction. And then there's a hill over here, which today is the site of UN Village. And that hill used to be where nobles and, Yangban, whatever, they would build their villas. There were pavilions there where they could look out over the Han River and over the lake. And there was a ferry here somewhere down in this area for years. But yeah, I'm not here to talk about all that today. Now, even before the Oksu-dong was built, scholars would come to this area to do their scholarly things because of the tranquility here, and they'd be free of distractions from within the city itself. And one of them painted a lovely landscape that depicts the lake. You can see the Oksu-dong there. Here we go again with those names that I didn't know the meaning of. But there's this story that the scholars who came here before Oksu-dong, the scholars who came here would wash their brushes in the Han River, and the sunlight reflecting off the ink floating in the water looked like jade. Su is water. Oksu, jade water. That's a story about where the name comes from. As with so many other 16th century Joseon dynasty structures, the Oksu-dong was destroyed during the Imjin War, a war that was fought with Japan, one in which the Chinese assisted. It was 7 years between 1592 and 1599. That's where the famous turtle ships were first deployed. And I think another interesting thing to note is that reading hall really doesn't carry the weight, I think, of the context of what that really was. The sign in English next to the stone called it a library. And though I guess in the sense that it's a place where documents and books were maintained, yeah, sure, that's a library in that sense. The scholars could go there and read the existing works that were there. But I think in the context of scholars reading Confucian texts and reading historical texts, it's not just reading, it's study, it's contemplation, right? So I think reading hall probably is not quite the translation that it should have. It should probably be called study hall at least, hall of study, because that's what they did. It was intense study. It wasn't just casual reading. It's not something they kicked back and looked out at the scenery of the lake and enjoyed a pleasant afternoon with a bit of fiction. No, this was scholarship. They were expanding their knowledge and trying to level up. Now, actually, today, Some people in English refer to this as Embassy Row, because right along here, you've got different embassies along the street, and Oksu-dong terminates at Hannam Boulevard up ahead, and on the other side, there's another street, which in Korean is called Taesagwon-ro, or Embassy Street. There are also a couple of embassies over there, not a whole lot, but this street and that street together, people often refer to them as Embassy Row. But I think maybe the reason embassies started sprouting up here was because of UN Village. UN Village itself is rather interesting. You might call it a gated community, even though it doesn't have a gate anymore, but it used to. And it actually was guarded by US soldiers for a while. I mentioned a little earlier that this hill that UN Village is on now, it was the site of the villas and pavilions that were constructed by nobles during the Joseon Dynasty to enjoy the scenery. But during the Japanese occupation, the Japanese took it over and started using it as the site of homes for their military officers. And by the way, yesterday was August 15th. That was Liberation Day in Korea, marking the end of Japanese occupation due to their surrender in World War II. So after World War II, I guess the US military would have taken control of that area as enemy territory because it was used by the Japanese military, but it apparently was turned back over to the Koreans. But after the Korean War, the president at the time, Syngman Rhee, made this land available for use by personnel coming over to Korea from the UN, the United Nations, and also to US military officers. But that's where the name UN Village comes from. It really was a community of United Nations personnel and US military officers for many years. But there used to be a gate here that was actually manned by US military, and they strictly controlled access. The gate is long gone. Up through the 70s, it was mostly foreigners living here. And in the 1980s, you had more and more Koreans coming in. And now it's, mostly Korean. And this is the only entrance. This is the only way in or out. And the street just makes a large loop around the top of the hill. And all it is today is just a bunch of villas, low-rise apartments. There are a couple of small apartment complexes up there with maybe 2 buildings, 3 buildings, whatever. But it's pretty much all low-rise apartments, low-rise villas, and rather pricey. trying to imagine what this would have been like 500 years ago with those 16th century villas around, pavilions up at the top of the hill where we had that view. Oh, trees all over the place. And you probably would have been able to see not just the river, but also the lake, the East Lake, just off to the east. Must have been really lovely here at the time. And we've done a full loop of UN Village. All right, so now we're back on Oksu-dong Street, Oksu-dong-no. You can just see the end of it where those cars are backed up down there. That's the intersection with Hannam-dong, Hannam Boulevard. And the traffic on this street going toward Hannam-dong can get backed up. So if you're ever coming this way from Oksu-dong and you're planning to turn right at the end of the street, you can avoid whatever traffic might be there, as this motorcycle is about to do. Right across the street from the embassies of India and South Africa, you've got this little street here. It comes out on Hannam-dong, well north of the intersection, the Hannam-oguri intersection. So you bypass all that traffic. This is one of those shortcuts that like taxi drivers know and locals know, but if you're not from the area, you're not going to know it. Right next to us here, this is Hannam the Hill Apartments. This used to be the university campus, Dankook University. I think they were originally established in the 1940s, 1948 maybe earlier, somewhere else, and they moved here, I believe, after the Korean War. I could be wrong about that, but they were here for several decades. And then in the 1990s, they decided to relocate the campus to Suji, down in Yongin. And they picked out some land there, and I guess they bought the land. This was 1995, I think, 1996. But then we got hit with the economic crisis, and the construction company that was working on the new campus had difficulties and was unable to do the project. And if I'm not mistaken, Dankook University, because of that crisis and because of the debt they had accumulated and because of their inability to get the new campus built, ended up becoming the first Korean university to declare bankruptcy. But they did eventually get relocated in 2007. And I found that a very interesting time because my wife and I were living in Hannam-dong at the time. And up until then, I had never really considered Hannam-dong a university neighborhood. Even though the university is here, you know, it's not such a large campus. And oh, that's cool. I've never seen this. Yeah, so I never considered Hannam-dong a university neighborhood, you know, not like some of the neighborhoods you see like Hongdae or Shincheon outside of, you know, Yonsei University, or even Sungshin Women's University outside there, you know. Hannam-dong just was not that kind of college neighborhood. However, a lot of the businesses that were in Hannam-dong apparently were dependent or believed themselves to be dependent on the business from the university campus here, because when they heard about the plans to relocate the campus, that they were underway, the shop owners down here started staging protests against the move. Of course, it was futile. It was going to happen. You know, they already had the land and eventually had the construction done. So the campus relocated, and then the developer bought it, and Hannam, the hill, was born. The local shop owners were worried about a negative economic impact, but it never really materialized. I think most of the shops that were here stayed open. I remember there was a chicken shop here, fried chicken, old style fried chicken, not the new modern stuff, but I mean the old style, little hole in the wall, run down, dingy little place. Oh gosh, it was so good. But yeah, it eventually gentrified, and now the prices, the real estate prices, they've just skyrocketed. So it wasn't the loss of the university students that those former shop owners had to worry about. It was the incoming cafes and bakeries and boutiques, the escalating property values, and the ever climbing rent. So that part of Hannam-dong did change, but not from any kind of lack of business or depreciation of property values, for sure. If you saw my 3 a.m. walk from Hannam-dong to Gangnam, down by the Han River, I started it right here. And I thought this would be a fitting place to end it. They've recently redone the surface here. Very new concrete. The main reason I wanted to end here is to point out, right over this overpass, on the other side of this overpass, you see the road goes up again. That is the Hannam Bridge. Hannam Bridge is actually 2 bridges, and I'll talk about that in a future video. But right now, I just want to point out, in the context of history, specifically Joseon era history, there used to be a ferry there, and it was called Hangang-jin. Now, you may have heard of Mapo-gu. Mapo was also the location of a ferry. Mapo can be translated literally, I think, as hemp port. Po means port. When you see it, usually it refers to a port. But this was Hangang-jin. Po refers to the actual physical port, right? It's the riverside embankment, the location of the pier, the quay, the dock, whatever. But Jin is more like the route, the crossing, the ferry crossing. So you can translate Hangang-jin as the Han River. Hangang is Han River, so you can translate it as Han River Ferry or Han River Crossing. Either way is fine. And that lives on in a subway station name just right up the street here, just around the bend. You'll find Hangang-jin Station. And one last thing to reference while I'm here, because it's as good a time as any to talk about it, is this empty lot. Now, up on the hill over there, you see those old buildings. That is still Hannam-dong. That's the old low property value area of Hannam-dong that was frozen in time. It's all now part of the Hannam Newtown project. It is walled off. There's no access to it now, except through the big gates that the heavy machinery uses, and you can just see the tips of some cranes rising out above the buildings there. I guess the demolition on that is starting soon if it hasn't already. You see the Itaewon Mosque That's Itaewon off on that side. That area is not part of the redevelopment zone. The redevelopment zone basically ends at the mosque there. So everything on that side is going to be gone on the hilltop. Down below that, you've got the Embassy Street, Daesagwon-no. That's where the Sungcheongyang University Hospital is, which is that building right there, right in front of us. And this field in front of us here, this used to be a softball field, baseball field. Used to be right here. And there was a gate over here, and you would drive in through the gate, and there was a road that separated the two sides of the field here. There were buildings here. Oh, actually, yeah, the softball field was on that side. My bad. Yeah, the softball field was over there, and there were some buildings here, administrative buildings, I guess. And then you had the military apartments here. And this property was not managed by the US military. I think it was actually managed by the Korean government. The same office in the government that managed the old foreigner apartments on Namsan. But yeah, they had a little self-contained community here. They had their own little mini PX, the post exchange. The main PX was on the main post of Yongsan Garrison nearby. They had a mini commissary, a mini grocery store. The commissary on base was a huge grocery store, supermarket, but the one here was a smaller. If you don't know, the US military relocated everything down to a place near Pyeongtaek, south of Seoul. Most of the forces that were north of the river, the Han River, were relocated there. Some were relocated elsewhere. But pretty much everything that was at Yongsan Garrison went there, except for a small little contingent that's still there on a small strip of land. So that was in 2018, but they moved everybody out of Hannam Village in 2014. And a property developer bought it in 2016. And then they started work on the 9-1 apartments here. And from what I understand, 9-1 is now the most expensive apartment complex in Seoul. At least that's what I've heard. I really haven't looked into it or tried to verify that. I just hear people talking about it. Well, thank you for joining me on this walk today. I hope you enjoyed the little bit of history we talked about and the more recent history here. I will return to Hannam-dong in a future video to talk about some of my memories, but I think it's going to be a while. If you have any questions you'd like me to answer about anything I've talked about in my videos, things you want to know about me, I will answer to a certain extent. I try to keep some things to myself. Or questions about what it's like living in Korea. I can't really give you advice on how to find jobs or how to get a visa. I really don't have any special insight into any of that. I haven't had to look for a job here in many years. I haven't had to worry about a visa here in many years. I'm talking decades, right? 20 years, over 20 years. And I mentioned that because those are probably the most common questions I get. But aside from those topics, if you have anything you'd like to ask me, feel free to shoot me a line at Q&A@MikeFromKorea.com. I'll try to answer your questions, and I will answer your questions in a reply to your email, and I may include your question in a future Q&A video. And that is all I have for you today. Thanks a lot for coming with me and hanging out for a bit. Thanks for liking, thanks for subscribing. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. There's a stone wall in there. And it looks old, right? So clearly, it serves some purpose. And I wonder what that purpose was. It looks like it's the foundation of some kind of small building. So this is something I'm curious in learning about.